I'm Edward Grayson, 38. A quiet veteran who spent 15 years being dismissed as a desk jockey by my own family. At every gathering, my brother, the decorated Marine, would smirk when people asked about my service. Edward, he just pushed papers in Germany, never saw real action. The words stung deeper each time, especially coming from people who were supposed to know me best. But 3 weeks ago, everything changed when a thick envelope arrived from the Pentagon with a declassification stamp. What my family discovered about those boring years would silence every doubt and reveal a truth that even I had been forbidden to speak until now. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt invisible or undervalued for work that truly mattered, this story is for you. Like if you know sometimes the most important battles are the ones no one can see. The smell of charcoal and barbecue sauce filled the backyard as I pulled into my parents' driveway for our annual 4th of July gathering. My old military photo, the one from basic training where I look 18 and eager, sat dusty on the mantelpiece inside, overlooked by everyone who passed it. That faded portrait had witnessed 15 years of family conversations where my service was treated like a footnote. Derek's truck was already there, of course. My older brother never missed an opportunity to hold court about his Marine deployments. As I walked through the back gate, I could hear his voice booming across the patio, regaling our cousins with another story about Fallujah. So there we were, taking fire from 3 directions. Derek gestured wildly with his beer bottle, and I had to make a split-second decision that saved my entire squad. The family hung on every word. Mum beamed with pride, Dad nodded approvingly, and our cousins leaned in closer. This was Derek's element, the center of attention, the war hero, the son who made them proud. Edward, Mum, spotted me first. Come join us. Derek was just telling us about his Bronze Star. I forced a smile and grabbed a beer from the cooler. Sounds like quite a story. Derek clapped me on the back with that patronizing grin I'd grown to hate. Hey, little brother, how's the civilian life treating you? Can't complain. I took a long sip of beer, already feeling the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Edward was in the army too, Mum told our cousin Jake, who was visiting from Colorado. He served overseas in Germany for several years. Jake perked up with interest. Really? What did you do over there? Before I could answer, Derek jumped in. Edward was more of a behind-the-scenes guy. Intelligence, analysis, logistics, that sort of thing. Important work, but not exactly boots-on-the-ground combat like some of us. The dismissal was casual, almost gentle, but it cut deep. Jake's expression shifted from interest to polite acknowledgement. Same look I'd seen dozens of times when people learned I wasn't a real combat veteran. Still, Jake offered diplomatically, "Somebody's got to handle the paperwork, right?" I nodded and took another drink. What could I say? That my paperwork had prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks. That my logistics had saved thousands of lives. That while Derek was fighting conventional battles with conventional enemies, I was preventing wars most people would never even know about. Edward's always been the brainy one, Dad chimed in, meaning it as a compliment, but somehow making it sound like a consolation prize. Different kinds of service for different kinds of people. The conversation moved on, as it always did, leaving me standing there with my beer and my secrets. Derek launched into another story about urban warfare tactics, and the family gathered around him like moths to a flame. I walked over to the fence and stared at the neighbor's garden, thinking about that Pentagon envelope sitting on my kitchen counter 3 states away. Standing by that fence, watching Derek hold court, I couldn't help but think about how we'd gotten here. The pattern had been set long before either of us ever put on a uniform. Growing up, Derek was the golden child star quarterback, homecoming king, the son who made Dad's chest swell with pride at every high school football game. I was the quiet one in the corner, nose buried in books, more interested in strategy games and computer programming than throwing footballs or impressing girls. When Derek scored the winning touchdown senior year, the whole town celebrated. When I won the state mathematics competition, it barely warranted a mention at dinner. "That's nice, honey," Mum had said, already focused on Derek's college recruitment letters. The military recruitment fair changed nothing. Derek strutted up to the Marine booth like he owned the place, all swagger and confidence. "I want to fight for my country," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. The recruiter's eyes lit up. Here was poster boy material. I wandered over to the Army intelligence table, drawn by their presentation on cybersecurity and global threat assessment. The recruiter was a quiet master sergeant who spoke in measured tones about protecting America through information warfare. When I scored in the 99th percentile on the ASVAB, he pulled me aside. "Son, have you ever heard of military intelligence?" he asked. "We need people who think differently, who can see patterns others miss." Derek shipped out to Paris Island with fanfare. The whole family drove down for his graduation. When I left for basic training and then advanced individual training for intelligence analysis, Dad shook my hand and said, "Well, at least you'll be safe behind a desk." That assumption followed me through my entire career. Every family gathering, every phone call home, every letter I wrote carefully omitted the real nature of my work. How could I explain that my desk job involved tracking international terrorist networks? That my paperwork included threat assessments that reached the highest levels of government? Derek's medal display case sat prominently in my parents' living room. Bronze Star, Combat Action Ribbon, various unit citations. My parents had offered to display my awards too, but what could I show them? A bunch of certificates with blacked out mission details and commendations I wasn't allowed to discuss. The irony was crushing. Derek's missions, while dangerous and worthy of respect, were straightforward: engage the enemy, secure the objective, protect your squad. My work required me to prevent conflicts before they started, to neutralize threats that would never make the evening news precisely because we'd stopped them in time. While Derek was earning his decorations in firefights that lasted hours, I was spending months tracking financial networks that funded terror cells, analyzing communication patterns that revealed assassination plots, coordinating with international partners to prevent attacks that could have killed thousands. But success in intelligence work is measured by what doesn't happen. Every catastrophe prevented, every attack thwarted, every war avoided. Invisible victories that leave no headlines, no medal ceremonies, no stories to tell at family barbecues. So I learned to stay quiet, to let Derek have his moment, to accept being the brother who pushed papers while he was the hero who served his country. The classification requirements made the choice easy. I literally couldn't defend myself without violating federal law. But that envelope on my kitchen counter was about to change everything. Those mysterious years in Germany weren't mysterious. To me, they were the most intense, purposeful, and important period of my life. But to my family, they might as well have been an extended European vacation with occasional paperwork. My assignment to the 66th Military Intelligence Brigade at Darmstadt seemed straightforward enough on the surface. When people asked what I did, I'd give them the sanitized version: intelligence analysis and logistical support for NATO operations. Technically true, but about as revealing as saying Derek traveled extensively in the Middle East. The reality was far more complex. My days began at 0400 with classified briefings that would make Hollywood thrillers seem tame. Terrorist financing, networks, weapons, smuggling operations, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. These weren't abstract threats in PowerPoint presentations. They were active, evolving dangers that required immediate, decisive action. I kept a personal journal. During those years, carefully coded to avoid any security violations. Reading through it now, I can see the weight of what I was carrying. Long day at the office, I'd write after spending 18 hours tracking a cell planning to bomb the Munich Christmas market. Completed quarterly reports meant we'd successfully disrupted a weapons shipment headed for 3 different terrorist organizations. The isolation was profound. I couldn't tell my family that I was working directly with CIA operatives, or that my analysis had contributed to preventing a dirty bomb attack in London. When Derek called from Iraq, full of stories about IED sweeps and checkpoint security, I'd listen and offer the appropriate responses. What could I say in return? That while he was fighting a war everyone could see, I was preventing wars most people would never know existed. My security clearance wasn't just a job requirement, it was a wall between me and everyone I loved. The people I worked with understood the weight of what we carried, but we couldn't discuss it outside our secure facilities. My family got Christmas cards and birthday calls, but they never got the real Edward Grayson. The hardest part was the complete absence of recognition. Derek's unit would be featured in military publications when they completed successful operations. My successes were measured by silence. No news was literally good news. Every attack that didn't happen, every crisis that was quietly resolved, every international incident that was prevented through careful intelligence, work invisible victories that left no trace except in classified files. My parents would call every few weeks, always with the same questions. How's work? Fine. Are you staying safe? Of course. When are you coming home? Eventually, they genuinely cared, but they were asking about a life that didn't exist. Simple, safe, administrative career they'd imagined for me. Meanwhile, I was working operations that spanned continents. A financial analyst in Berlin might notice unusual transactions that I'd flag as potential terror funding. That information would flow through my desk to analysts in London, who'd coordinate with operatives in 3 different countries to trace the money back to its source. Within weeks, entire networks would be quietly dismantled without a single shot fired. The psychological toll was enormous. I was saving lives on a scale that Derek's combat missions, heroic as they were, simply couldn't match. But I couldn't share that burden with anyone. My journal entries from that period are filled with frustration, isolation, and a growing sense that my family would never understand who I really was or what I really did. When Derek was injured by an IED in Ramadi, the whole family mobilized. Cards, flowers, visits. He was the wounded warrior who deserved their support and admiration. When I worked 72 hours straight to prevent a chemical weapons attack on a NATO base, I got a brief "thanks for your service" email from my commanding officer and went back to my empty apartment to eat dinner alone. But that was the job. That was what I'd signed up for. Service without recognition, sacrifice without glory, protection without acknowledgement. I had no idea that someday the truth would finally come to light. 3 weeks before Derek's retirement party, I was sorting through mail in my Denver apartment when I saw it, a thick manila envelope with the unmistakable Pentagon seal embossed in the corner. My name and address were typed on an official label, and in the upper right corner, stamped in red ink, were the words that made my heart skip: declassified material. I set the envelope on my kitchen table and stared at it for a full minute. In 15 years of civilian life, I'd never received anything like this. The military had been a closed chapter, a collection of memories and experiences I'd assumed would remain forever, locked away in classified files. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. Inside were dozens of documents, mission summaries, commendations, intelligence reports, and communication logs, all bearing official seals, all stamped with declassification dates from the past 6 months. The top sheet was a cover letter from the Department of Defense, explaining that recent policy changes had resulted in the declassification of certain Cold War and early War on Terror intelligence operations. I pulled out the first document and felt my breath catch. It was a mission summary from October 2003, detailing Operation Silent Guardiana, joint intelligence operation I'd coordinated to prevent a coordinated attack on American military bases across Europe. The document laid out, in stark official language, how my analysis had identified the threat, tracked the operatives, and provided the intelligence that led to the arrests of 14 terrorists in 6 different countries. The second document was even more stunning: personal commendation from the director of the CIA, thanking me by name for my extraordinary service in preventing catastrophic loss of life. It was dated just 2 weeks after Derek had been injured in Iraq, when my family was focused entirely on his recovery, and I was working round the clock to stop what intelligence indicated was a planned chemical weapons attack. Document after document revealed the scope of work I'd never been able to discuss: financial network analysis that had disrupted terror funding, communication intercepts that had prevented assassinations, coordination with international partners that had stopped weapons smuggling operations. My desk job had touched operations spanning 3 continents and involving some of the most sensitive national security matters of the past 2 decades. I found myself crying as I read through the files, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of relief. For the first time in my adult life, I was holding proof of what I'd actually done, what I'd actually accomplished, what I'd actually been worth. The final document in the stack was a letter from the Secretary of Defense, recently declassified, thanking me for my exemplary service in protecting American interests through intelligence operations of the highest sensitivity and importance. I sat back in my chair and thought about Derek's retirement party, about his speeches and his stories, and his assumption that I'd never done anything that mattered. It was time to set the record straight. The deeper I dug into the declassified documents, the more astounded I became at what I was finally allowed to see. Satellite reconnaissance photos, marked top secret until just months ago, showed locations I remembered all too well, but now I could see the full scope of what we'd been tracking. One photograph showed a warehouse complex outside Frankfurt that I'd spent 6 months analyzing. The intelligence summary attached revealed that our surveillance had uncovered a massive arms smuggling operation funneling weapons to terrorist cells across Europe. My routine logistical analysis had actually been tracking shipping manifests, cross-referencing financial transactions, and identifying patterns that revealed how legitimate businesses were being used as cover for weapons trafficking. The operation, codenamed Iron Web, had resulted in the seizure of enough explosives to level city blocks. According to the declassified after-action report, my analysis had been instrumental in preventing what intelligence assessments indicated would have been coordinated attacks on civilian targets during the 2004 Christmas season across multiple European capitals. Christmas season, 2004. I remembered that period vividly, working 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in my office, missing the family Christmas gathering because I was too busy with year-end reports. My parents had been disappointed, but not surprised. Edward's always been a workaholic, Mum had told Derek over the phone. Some people just can't balance work and family. If they'd only known I was spending Christmas week coordinating with intelligence agencies in 7 different countries to prevent attacks that could have killed thousands of holiday shoppers. Another document detailed my role in Operation Nightfall, a counterintelligence operation that had identified and neutralized a network of double agents within NATO intelligence services. The summary credited my pattern analysis with uncovering a sophisticated espionage ring that had compromised sensitive military operations and endangered the lives of covert operatives throughout Eastern Europe. I'd never been told the full scope of that operation. At the time, I knew only that my job was to analyze communication patterns and identify anomalies in information flow. I had no idea that my work had led to the arrest of 12 foreign intelligence operatives and the protection of dozens of Allied agents whose covers had been blown. The most stunning revelation came in a presidential briefing summary from 2006. My analysis of intercepted communications had identified chatter indicating a planned attack on the Munich Security Conference, one of the world's most important gatherings of defense ministers and heads of state. The document detailed how my intelligence had led to the discovery of a sophisticated plot involving multiple terrorist cells and even sympathizers within the conference security team. The attack had been planned for the opening ceremony, when hundreds of world leaders and defense officials would be gathered in one location. The briefing summary estimated that successful execution would have killed or wounded virtually the entire Western defense establishment and likely triggered a global security crisis. My role had been to monitor communications, intercepts, and identify anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the conference. What I'd found was a pattern of coded messages that seemed innocuous individually but revealed a coordinated operation when analyzed collectively. The intelligence I'd provided had led to arrests across 3 countries and the complete disruption of what the CIA classified as potentially the most significant terrorist operation of the post-9/11 era. The conference had proceeded without incident. Angela Merkel had delivered her opening remarks on time. Defense ministers from 40 countries had attended their sessions as planned. The international media had covered the policy discussions and diplomatic agreements. Nobody had reported on the attack that didn't happen. Nobody had interviewed the world leaders who were still alive because of intelligence work conducted in a windowless office building in Darmstadt, Germany. Nobody had written headlines about the analyst who'd connected dots that others had missed. But now, spread across my kitchen table, was documentary proof that my desk job had quite literally changed the course of history. While Derek was earning his Bronze Star for heroism in combat, I was preventing conflicts that would have made his war look like a minor skirmish. The weight of it was overwhelming. For the first time in my adult life, I understood the true magnitude of what I'd been. Part of Derek's call came 2 days after I'd finished reading through the declassified documents. His voice boomed through my phone with the same confidence that had dominated every family gathering for the past 2 decades. "Edward, you're not going to believe this, but I've finally decided to hang up the uniform. 22 years, brother, it's time for this old Marine to retire." I congratulated him, genuinely meaning it. Despite everything, Derek had served his country with honor and distinction. His path had just been different from mine, more visible, more traditional, more easily understood by family and friends. "Mum and Dad are throwing me a retirement party next month," he continued. "You better clear your calendar. I'm talking the whole family, friends from the cause, maybe even some of the guys from my old unit if they can make it. It's going to be epic." He paused, and I could practically hear his grin through the phone. "You know what the best part is? I finally get to tell all my war stories without worrying about operational security. I've got enough material to keep everyone entertained for hours." My grip tightened on the phone. "Sounds like quite a celebration." "Oh, it will be. And hey, I've been working on my speech, really trying to capture what real military service means, you know. The brotherhood, the sacrifice, the boots-on-the-ground reality of protecting America." His tone shifted slightly, taking on that patronizing quality I knew so well. "I mean, not everyone can understand what combat is really like, but I figure I owe it to the family to share some of those experiences." I thought about the documents on my kitchen table, the photos of terrorist safe houses, the intercepted communications that had prevented assassinations, the intelligence summaries, the detailed operations spanning continents. "I'm sure it'll be very enlightening. You know, Edward, I've always respected what you did over there in Germany. Support roles are crucial. Someone's got to handle the logistics and paperwork while the rest of us are out there engaging the enemy. Different types of service, right? There it was, again, the casual dismissal wrapped in false respect. The assumption that my years overseas had been spent filing reports while he was out saving the world. The condescending acknowledgement that my work was important too, in the same tone you'd use to thank the janitor who cleaned up after the real heroes. I looked at the formal retirement ceremony program he'd texted me earlier, complete with his photo and a detailed list of his commendations. It was impressive: Bronze Star with V device, Combat Action Ribbon, 2 Purple Hearts, multiple unit citations. Derek had genuinely earned every honor listed, but sitting next to my declassified documents, his achievements told only part of the story of American military service. His medals represented courage under fire, leadership in combat, and dedication to his brothers in arms. Mine represented conflicts that had never happened, attacks that had been prevented, wars that had been avoided through invisible victories that left no headlines and required no parades. I'll definitely be there, I told him. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Great. And who knows, maybe you'll even get a chance to share some of your own stories. I'm sure people would love to hear about the administrative side of military operations. I smiled, thinking about that envelope from the Pentagon. I might just do that, Derek. I might just do that. After Derek's call, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering how I'd carried the weight of those secrets for so long. The man looking back at me had spent 15 years pretending to be someone he wasn't, not just to his family, but to himself. I'd started seeing Dr. Patricia Williams at the VA hospital about 3 years ago, not for PTSD in the traditional sense, but for what I'd described as adjustment issues related to family relationships. How do you explain to a therapist that your family thinks you're a failure when you can't tell them what you actually accomplished? My therapist notes, which I'd requested from the VA after seeing the declassified documents, painted a picture of someone struggling with profound frustration and isolation. Dr. Williams had been surprisingly perceptive, even without knowing the classified details of my service. Edward, she'd written in one session summary, appears to be carrying a burden of unrecognized achievement. While he cannot discuss the specifics of his military service due to classification requirements, his demeanor suggests someone whose contributions have been systematically undervalued by those closest to him. In another note, patient expresses feelings of invisibility within family dynamic. Despite evidence of significant professional accomplishments, he is unable to share. Recommend continued work on internal validation versus external recognition. Reading those notes now, I realized how accurately she'd assessed my situation without knowing any of the details. During our sessions, I'd spoken in careful generalities about feeling misunderstood, about carrying responsibilities I couldn't explain, about the isolation that comes from living with secrets. The hardest part, I'd told her during one particularly difficult session, is watching people you love dismiss something that defined your entire adult life. They think they know who I am, but they're responding to a person who doesn't really exist. Dr. Williams had leaned forward in her chair. Edward, do you define your worth by their understanding of your service? I shouldn't, I'd admitted. But it's hard not to when they're the people whose opinions matter most to me. What if, she'd asked gently, their understanding isn't necessary for your service to have value? What if their approval isn't required for your accomplishments to be real? At the time, those words had felt hollow. How could my accomplishments be real if the people I loved most saw me as a professional disappointment? How could I feel proud of work that had to remain forever hidden? But now, with the declassified documents spread across my kitchen table, I understood what she'd been trying to tell me. The value of my service hadn't been diminished by my family's ignorance of it. Their lack of understanding hadn't made my contributions less real or less important. I thought about the thousands of people who are alive today because of intelligence operations I'd helped coordinate. Families who'd never know their Christmas shopping trips hadn't ended in tragedy because we'd prevented the attacks. World leaders who'd never realized they'd escaped assassination because we'd identified the threats in advance. Soldiers who'd come home safely because we'd disrupted the weapons. Networks that would have supplied their enemies. Those people didn't know my name or my story, but their safety had been real. Their lives had been preserved. Their families had remained intact. The value of that work existed independent of recognition or acknowledgement. Dr. Williams had been right about something else, too. In our final session, before I'd moved to Denver, she'd said something that had stuck with me. Someday, Edward, you may find that the truth has a way of revealing itself. When that happens, I hope you'll be ready to accept the recognition you've always deserved. I looked at the Pentagon envelope on my counter and smiled. That day had arrived sooner than either of us had expected. The weight I'd been carrying for 15 years was finally about to be lifted, not just from my shoulders, but from my family's understanding of who I really was. With Derek's retirement party just weeks away, I decided to do some research of my own. If I was going to share the truth about my service, I wanted to understand not just what I'd accomplished, but how it compared to the broader scope of military operations during the same period. I started with Derek's service record, which was largely public information. His deployments to Iraq had been part of conventional military operations, dangerous, necessary, and worthy of respect, but also well documented and widely reported. The battles he'd fought were covered by embedded journalists. The objectives he'd helped secure were announced in Pentagon press briefings. His unit's achievements were featured in Marine Corps publications and veteran magazines. Meanwhile, my work had operated in the shadows of the same conflict. While Derek was engaging insurgents in Fallujah, I was tracking the financial networks that funded those insurgents. While his unit was clearing buildings and securing neighborhoods, my analysis was helping to prevent the weapons and explosives from reaching those buildings in the first place. A declassified CIA memo I found online mentioned me by name, something that sent a chill down my spine when I first read it. The document, recently released through Freedom of Information Act requests, detailed how intelligence provided by analyst Edward Grayson had been crucial in preventing what the agency classified as a black swan event, an attack so significant it would have fundamentally altered the course of American foreign policy. The memo referred to Operation Damocles, which I remembered working on in 2005. At the time, I'd been analyzing communication intercepts that suggested a coordinated attack being planned for the Green Zone in Baghdad. My job had been to identify patterns in the chatter and assess the credibility of the threat. What I hadn't known was that the attack being planned wasn't just another bombing, it was an attempt to assassinate the Iraqi Prime Minister, the American ambassador, and 3 members of Congress who were visiting Baghdad. The memo revealed that my analysis had identified not just the timing and location of the planned attack, but also the involvement of sympathizers within the Green Zone security forces. The operation to prevent the attack had required coordination between the CIA, military intelligence, and Iraqi security forces. According to the memo, the intelligence I'd provided had been instrumental in neutralizing the threat and preventing what would have constituted the most significant political assassination in the Iraqi theater of operations. The assassination of those officials would have destabilized the Iraqi government, potentially derailed peace negotiations, and almost certainly led to a massive escalation of American military involvement. Instead, the congressmen had completed their visit safely. The Prime Minister had continued his work toward political reconciliation, and the American ambassador had remained in place to oversee critical diplomatic initiatives. None of that had made the news. The congressman probably never knew how close they'd come to death. The ambassador had likely never been briefed on the specific threat that had been neutralized. The Iraqi prime minister had gone about his business, unaware that his survival had depended on pattern analysis conducted in a secure facility thousands of miles away. But Derek had been in Iraq during that same period, and his unit had benefited from the intelligence we'd provided. The attacks that didn't happen, the bombs that were never planted, the ambushes that were prevented, all of that had made his mission safer and more successful. I realized that Derek and I hadn't been serving in different wars. We'd been fighting the same war from different angles, using different tools, achieving different types of victories. His were visible and immediate. Mine were invisible and preventive. Both had been essential. Both had saved lives. Both had served America's interests. But only one of us had been able to tell that story. Derek's retirement party was shaping up to be exactly what I'd expected. A celebration of everything our family considered real. Military service, the invitations, which Mum had designed herself, featured a photo of Derek in his dress blues, surrounded by patriotic imagery and quotes about honor, courage, and sacrifice. I'd driven down from Denver the night before, staying in my old room at my parents' house. Walking past Derek's childhood bedroom, I noticed his metal display case had been moved to a more prominent position in the hallway. The bronze star with V device took center stage, flanked by his Purple Hearts and Combat Action ribbon. Below the medals was a framed photo of his unit after a successful operation in Ramadi, their faces dusty and exhausted but triumphant. It was genuinely impressive, and I felt a surge of pride for my brother's service. Whatever our family dynamics, Derek had earned every one of those decorations through courage and dedication that deserved recognition. But sitting on the nightstand in my room was my own collection of documents, the Pentagon envelope and its contents, carefully organized and ready to share. I'd spent hours deciding which documents would be most appropriate to discuss publicly, balancing the desire to set the record straight with ongoing security considerations. At breakfast, Derek was already in full celebration mode, working on his speech notes while Mum fussed over party preparations. I watched him scribble down memories and anecdotes, structuring his remarks around themes of brotherhood, sacrifice, and what he called the true meaning of military service. You know what I realized, Edward? Derek looked up from his notes. We're probably the only family most people know with 2 military veterans. That's pretty special. I nodded, sipping my coffee. Different kinds of service, but service nonetheless. Exactly. Derek's tone was earnest, seemingly oblivious to the condescension that usually crept into these conversations. I mean, not everyone's cut out for combat operations, but that doesn't make support roles any less important. Somebody's got to handle the logistics, right? Mum beamed at this display of brotherly inclusiveness. It's so wonderful that you boys both found ways to serve your country that suited your different strengths. Different strengths? I almost laughed at the irony. If only they knew that my strengths had included preventing international incidents. That would have made Derek's combat operations look like minor skirmishes. I was thinking, Derek continued, maybe during my speech tonight, I could call you up to say a few words to, give people a perspective on the behind-the-scenes work that makes frontline operations possible. The setup was perfect. Derek was literally going to invite me to speak about my service in front of the entire family and all his military friends. He was going to hand me a microphone and ask me to share my perspective on what military service really meant. I thought about the declassified presidential briefing in my room upstairs, the one that credited my intelligence work with preventing a potential catastrophe that could have killed world leaders and destabilized international relations. I'd be honored to say a few words, I told him. I think I might have some interesting stories to share, after all. Derek grinned and clapped me on the back. That's the spirit, little brother. Time to show everyone that the Grayson family knows how to serve. He had no idea how right he was about to be. The retirement party began at 6 o'clock in the VFW hall Derek had rented for the occasion. By the time I arrived, the place was already packed with family, friends, and fellow Marines who'd served. With Derek over his 22-year career, red, white, and blue streamers hung from the ceiling, and a slideshow of Derek's military career played on a screen near the head table. I'd brought the declassified documents in a leather portfolio, keeping them close as I made my way through the crowd. The contrast between Derek's celebration and my own quiet preparation felt surreal, like I was carrying a secret weapon to a battle nobody knew was about to begin. Edward, Dad spotted me first, pulling me into a bear hug. There's my other son, the one who kept the paperwork flowing while Derek was out there fighting the good fight. I forced a smile and accepted the familiar characterization. Around us, Derek's Marine buddies were sharing their own war stories, their voices growing louder as the beer flowed and the memories became more vivid. These were good men Marines who'd served with honor and courage, but their stories all followed a familiar pattern: firefights and brotherhood, courage under fire, split-second decisions that saved lives. I found myself studying a family photo from my deployment years that Mum had included in the display. It showed Derek and me in our respective uniforms during one of our rare overlapping leaves. Derek looked every inch the warrior, confident, strong, ready for whatever combat awaited him. I looked younger, quieter, almost scholarly in comparison. The photo had been taken just days before I'd returned to Germany to begin work on what would become Operation Silent Guardian. Derek had been heading back to Iraq for his second deployment. We'd shaken hands at the airport, wished each other luck, and gone our separate ways to serve our country in vastly different theaters. What nobody knew was that both of us had been heading toward the most critical periods of our respective careers. Derek would earn his Bronze Star for heroism during the Battle of Ramadi. I would spend the next 6 months coordinating intelligence that would prevent terrorist attacks across 3 continents. Ladies and gentlemen, Derek's voice boomed across the hall as he tapped his microphone. If I could have everyone's attention, I'd like to begin the formal program. The room quieted as people found their seats. I noticed several of Derek's former commanding officers in attendance, along with what appeared to be a significant representation from his old unit. These were people who understood military service from the traditional perspective: boots on the ground, mission accomplished, enemy defeated. Derek began with thanks to family and friends, then launched into a reflection on what military service had meant to him. His words were genuine and moving, touching on themes of sacrifice, brotherhood, and duty that resonated throughout the room. As he spoke, I found myself genuinely proud of my brother's service and the man he'd become. But I also found myself thinking about all the other ways to serve, all the other forms of sacrifice, all the other types of duty that went unrecognized and unsaid. The analysts who prevented conflicts before they started, the intelligence officers who saved lives through information rather than firepower, the quiet professionals who protected America through invisible victories that left no headlines and required no parades. Military service, Derek continued, his voice carrying across the silent room, means putting your life on the line for something greater than yourself. It means facing danger so others can sleep safely. It means understanding what real sacrifice looks like. I thought about the months I'd spent tracking terrorist financing networks, the weeks I'd worked around the clock to prevent chemical weapons attacks, the years I'd carried secrets that would have crushed my family if they'd known how close the world had come to catastrophe. Derek was building toward his conclusion, toward the moment when he'd invite me to speak. I could feel the documents in my portfolio, could sense the weight of truth that was about to shift the entire dynamic of our family's understanding. The gathering storm was about to break. Derek hit his stride as he moved into the heart of his speech, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world or his value to his family. 22 years ago, I raised my right hand and swore an oath to defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, he began, his combat action ribbon catching the light as he gestured. I had no idea what that oath would require of me, but I was ready to find out. The room was completely silent, hanging on every word. Derek had always been a natural storyteller, and tonight he was in his element. I want to tell you about a day in Ramadi when my squad was pinned down by insurgent fire from 3 directions. His voice dropped to draw everyone in. We'd been on patrol for 14 hours, and we were exhausted. But when we heard that call for help from another unit under attack, there was no question what we had to do. I'd heard this story before, but watching Derek tell it to an audience who truly understood the stakes was different. His fellow Marines nodded at the familiar rhythms of combat, the split-second decisions, the weight of responsibility for your brother's lives. That's when I learned what military service really means, Derek continued. It's not about the medals or the recognition. It's about the moment when you have to choose between your own safety and doing what's right. It's about understanding that some things are worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth dying for. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. Several of his former squad mates were nodding, their own memories clearly triggered by Derek's account. But military service isn't just about the guys who carry rifles, Derek said, and I felt my heart rate increase. Here, it came the moment when he'd acknowledged different types of service, while subtly reinforcing the hierarchy that put combat veterans at the top. It takes all kinds of people to make a military operation successful. Logistics specialists, communication technicians, administrative personnel, they all play crucial roles in supporting the mission. His smile was genuine as he looked toward my table. My brother Edward, for instance, spent years in Germany handling intelligence analysis and logistical support. Different from what I did, but important work nonetheless. The phrase important work nonetheless hung in the air like a polite dismissal. It was the verbal equivalent of a participation trophy acknowledgement, without real respect, inclusion without true equality. Edward understood that somebody has to handle the paperwork while the rest of us are out there engaging the enemy. Derek continued, his tone warm but unmistakably condescending. Support roles may not be glamorous, but they're necessary for combat operations to succeed. I felt the familiar sting of being characterized as support staff to Derek's main event. Around the room, people nodded politely, their attention already shifting back to Derek's more dramatic stories. So I want to thank all the support personnel who made our missions possible. Derek concluded this section, including my little brother, who kept the administrative side running smoothly while we focused on the fight. Little brother. Administrative side. Support personnel. It was time to change the narrative. Derek was building toward his conclusion when I quietly stood up from my table. The movement caught his attention, and he paused mid-sentence, slightly confused by the interruption. Sorry, Derek, I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly across the silent room. I was wondering if I could share something before you finish. Derek blinked, clearly not expecting this departure from the script. The audience turned to look at me. Members, Marines, friends who'd known me for years as the quiet brother who'd pushed papers in Germany. Of course, Derek said, though his expression suggested this wasn't part of his planned program. I was actually going to invite you to say a few words anyway. I walked to the front of the room, carrying my leather portfolio. The crowd watched, with polite attention, probably expecting a brief, self-deprecating speech about the importance of support roles in military operations. Thank you, Derek, and congratulations on 22 years of honorable service. I meant that sincerely. I wanted to share something that I've never been able to discuss before, but recent developments have made it possible. I opened my portfolio and pulled out the first document, the declassified mission summary from Operation Silent Guardian. The Pentagon seal was clearly visible, and several of Derek's Marine friends leaned forward, recognizing official military documentation when they saw it. 3 weeks ago, I received this envelope from the Pentagon, I said, holding up the thick manila folder. It contained declassified documents related to my service in Germany, documents that I was legally prohibited from discussing until now. The room's energy shifted. This wasn't the humble support staff speech they'd been expecting. Derek's expression changed from mild confusion to growing concern as he realized I was holding official government documents. For 15 years, I've let everyone believe that my job in Germany involved routine intelligence, analysis, and administrative support, I continued. And in a sense, that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. I held up the mission summary, making sure the top-secret markings were visible to the audience. This document details Operation Silent Guardian, a joint intelligence operation I coordinated in 2003 to prevent coordinated terrorist attacks on American military bases across Europe. Complete silence. Derek's mouth had fallen slightly open. According to this declassified CIA assessment, my analysis identified a network of operatives planning simultaneous attacks that would have killed hundreds of American servicemen and women. I paused, letting that sink in. The operation resulted in the arrest of 14 terrorists in 6 different countries and the prevention of what intelligence agencies classified as a potential catastrophic loss of life. I could see family members looking at each other in confusion. This wasn't the Edward Grayson, quiet administrator who'd never done anything important enough to mention. Here's another document, I continued, pulling out the presidential briefing summary. This details my role in preventing an attack on the 2006 Munich Security Conference, where defense ministers and heads of state from 40 countries were meeting. Intelligence indicated that successful execution of this attack would have killed or wounded virtually the entire Western defense establishment. Derek was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Our parents looked stunned. Around the room, his Marine friends were studying the documents with the trained eyes of military professionals who recognized the real thing when they saw it. The communication intercepts I analyzed revealed a sophisticated plot involving multiple terrorist cells and sympathizers within the conference security team, I explained. My intelligence led to arrests across 3 countries and the complete disruption of what the CIA classified as potentially the most significant terrorist operation of the post-9/11 era. I looked directly at Derek. So when you talk about putting your life on the line for something greater than yourself, when you talk about facing danger so others can sleep safely, when you talk about understanding what real sacrifice looks like, I want you to know that while you were earning your Bronze Star for heroism in combat, I was preventing conflicts that would have made your war look like a minor skirmish. The room was absolutely silent. Derek's face had gone pale. Different kinds of service, as you said, but equally important, equally honorable, equally real. I closed the portfolio and looked out at the shocked faces staring back at me. The only difference is that my war was fought in the shadows, and victory was measured by the catastrophes that never happened. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Derek found his voice. Edward, I had no idea. We had no idea. I pulled out another document, a Presidential Unit citation that had been awarded to my intelligence unit. This is a Presidential Unit citation for extraordinary heroism and outstanding performance of duty in action against an armed enemy. My unit received it for our role in disrupting international terrorist networks and preventing multiple coordinated attacks between 2003 and 2007. I handed the citation to Derek, who took it with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the document, taking in the official seals, the formal language, the weight of what he was reading. Here's a letter from the Secretary of Defense, I continued, producing another document. It thanks me personally for my exemplary service in protecting American interests through intelligence operations of the highest sensitivity and importance. Mum had tears in her eyes. Edward, why didn't you ever tell us? Because I couldn't, I replied simply. Everything I worked on was classified at levels that prohibited discussion with anyone lacking the appropriate clearance. For 15 years, I was legally forbidden from telling you what I actually did. I walked over to where Derek's commanding officer was sitting, a colonel who'd served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Colonel Morrison, you understand classification levels. Could you examine these documents and verify their authenticity? Colonel Morrison took the documents with the serious expression of someone who'd handled plenty of classified material in his career. He studied each page carefully, checking seals, signatures, and formatting. After several minutes, he looked up at the room. These are legitimate Pentagon documents, he announced. The classification markings, the official seals, the document formatting, this is real. And based on what I'm reading here, Edward's unit was involved in some of the most critical intelligence operations of the past 2 decades. He handed the documents back to me and stood up. Son, I owe you an apology. We all do. This is the kind of work that prevents wars before they start. The kind of intelligence that saves thousands of lives by stopping attacks that most people never even know were planned. Derek was still staring at the presidential unit citation. The Munich Security Conference, that was where Angela Merkel spoke about international cooperation. I remember watching it on the news. You watched it because my intelligence work made it possible for the conference to proceed safely, I said. Every defense minister who delivered a speech, every head of state who attended those sessions, every diplomatic agreement that was signed, all of that happened because we prevented an attack that would have decimated the Western defense establishment. I pulled out one final document, the declassified CIA memo that mentioned me by name. This memo details Operation Damocles, where my analysis prevented an assassination attempt in Baghdad's Green Zone. The targets included the Iraqi Prime Minister, the American ambassador, and 3 members of Congress who were visiting the region. Derek's face went white. I was in Baghdad during that time frame. My unit was providing security for VIP movements. Then you were protecting people who were alive because my intelligence work had identified and neutralized the assassination plot. I said, while you were earning your Bronze Star for courage under fire, I was preventing the fires from being set in the first place. I looked around the room at the stunned faces, family members who'd spent 15 years thinking I was a professional. Disappointment, Marines who'd assumed I'd never seen real action. Friends who'd politely endured my presence at military gatherings while focusing their attention on Derek's war stories. The warehouses we surveilled, the financial networks we traced, the communication intercepts we analyzed, all of that was happening while Derek was fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. We weren't serving in different wars. We were fighting the same war from different angles, using different tools, achieving different types of victories. I turned back to Derek. Your victories were visible and immediate, buildings cleared, objectives secured, enemies defeated. Mine were invisible and preventive attacks that didn't happen. Weapons that never reached their targets, conflicts that were resolved before they could escalate. Derek set down the presidential unit citation and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, respect, mixed with something that might have been awe. Edward, he stopped, shaking his head. All these years, I thought I was the only one in our family who'd really served. I thought I was the only one who'd seen real action, who'd made a real difference. You did make a real difference, I said firmly. Your service was crucial, heroic, and worthy of every honor you received. But it wasn't the only kind of service that mattered. I closed my portfolio and looked out at my family. Different kinds of service, as Derek said, but equally important, equally honorable, equally real. The silence that followed my revelation was broken by unexpected applause. It started with Colonel Morrison, then spread through Derek's Marine friends, and finally reached our family members. But it wasn't the polite acknowledgement I'd grown accustomed to. It was the genuine recognition of someone whose service had finally been properly understood. When the applause died down, Derek stepped forward and did something that stunned me more than any classified document could have. He removed his bronze star from his dress uniform and held it out to me. "Edward, I can't accept honors for service when my own brother," he stopped, his voice breaking slightly. "This belongs to you more than me." I gently pushed his hand back. "Derek, you earned that medal through courage and sacrifice. Your service saved lives and protected your brothers in arms. The fact that my service was different doesn't diminish what you accomplished. But all these years," Derek's eyes were watery, "all these years I've been acting like you never did anything important, like your service didn't matter. You didn't know," I said simply. "None of you could have known. And honestly, part of me preferred it that way. It was easier to let you think I was just pushing papers than to carry the frustration of knowing what I'd really done but being unable to share it." Mum approached us, tears streaming down her face. "Edward, honey, I am so sorry. All those family gatherings where we focused on Derek's stories while you sat quietly in the corner, you must have felt so invisible." I hugged her tightly. "I never felt invisible, Mum. I felt protected. Having a family that loved me for who they thought I was, rather than for what I'd accomplished, was actually a gift. It kept me grounded." Dad was studying the letter from the Secretary of Defense with the intense focus he usually reserved for important business documents. "Son, this says your work was instrumental in preventing what could have been the most significant terrorist operation of the post-9/11 era. Do you understand what that means?" "It means," said Colonel Morrison, who'd been reading over Dad's shoulder, "that Edward's intelligence work potentially saved more lives than entire combat divisions. This is the kind of analysis that shapes national security policy at the highest levels." One of Derek's former squad mates, a staff sergeant named Martinez, who I'd met at previous family gatherings, approached with a look of genuine respect. "Edward, I've been dismissing you for years as someone who'd never seen real action. But this," he gestured toward the documents, "this is action at a level most of us can't even comprehend. You were fighting battles we didn't even know existed." Derek nodded emphatically. "That's exactly right. While I was responding to threats, Edward was preventing them from becoming threats in the first place. While I was treating symptoms, he was curing the disease." The shift in family dynamics was immediate and profound. Suddenly, I wasn't the quiet brother who'd had an unremarkable military career. I was the intelligence analyst who'd prevented international catastrophes. I wasn't the family member whose service was politely acknowledged but never really understood. I was the one whose work had operated at levels of national security that most people could only imagine. But perhaps most importantly, I was finally able to be honest about who I really was and what I'd really done. The weight of carrying those secrets for 15 years, the isolation of being unable to share my experiences, the frustration of being consistently undervalued, the loneliness of living with a false identity, all of that was finally lifted. "You know what this means?" Derek asked, his voice regaining some of its usual confidence. "This means the Grayson family has produced two legitimate war heroes. Different wars, different weapons, different victories, but both equally important to protecting America." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't experienced at a family gathering in 15 years. I can live with that assessment. The rest of the evening took on a completely different character as people approached me with genuine curiosity about intelligence work, with respect for service they'd never understood, and with apologies for assumptions they'd never questioned. The weeks following Derek's retirement party brought a series of conversations I'd never imagined having with my family. For the first time in my adult life, I was able to share the reality of my military experience rather than the sanitized version I'd been forced to provide for security reasons. Derek called me the morning after the party, his voice carrying none of the casual dismissiveness that had characterized our relationship for so long. "Edward, I've been up all night thinking about what you shared yesterday. I need to ask you something. During my second deployment to Iraq, in early 2006, there was a period where our intelligence briefings suddenly became incredibly detailed and accurate. Was that related to your work?" I thought back to Operation Damocles and the intelligence sharing that had followed. "It's possible. We were providing a lot of actionable intelligence to ground commanders during that period." "Jesus," Derek breathed. "The information we received probably saved dozens of lives in my unit alone. We were able to avoid IED sites, identify potential ambush locations, even predict enemy movement patterns with unusual accuracy." It was gratifying to finally understand how my work had directly benefited Derek's operations. But more importantly, it seemed to help Derek understand that our service had been complementary rather than competitive. "You know what's crazy?" Derek continued. "All these years I've been thinking of military service in terms of a hierarchy: combat troops at the top, support personnel below. But that's completely backwards, isn't it? Your work was preventing conflicts that would have made my job infinitely more dangerous." My parents' approach was different, but equally meaningful. Mum had framed several of my commendation letters alongside Derek's medals in the family display case, creating what she called a proper representation of Grayson family service. Dad, meanwhile, had spent hours researching intelligence operations online, trying to understand the broader context of the work I'd described. I found an article about the Munich Security Conference, Dad told me during one of our phone calls. It mentioned how unusual it was that security proceeded so smoothly despite intelligence indicating elevated threat levels. They credited exceptional international intelligence cooperation for the conference's success. That was the public version, I confirmed. They couldn't exactly announce that we'd prevented an assassination plot that would have killed half the Western defense establishment. "And we never knew," Dad said quietly. "For years, we never knew that our son was involved in preventing international catastrophes." The most profound change came in my relationship with Derek himself. Our conversations began to include genuine mutual respect and curiosity about each other's experiences. Derek started asking detailed questions about intelligence analysis, while I found myself gaining a deeper appreciation for the courage required for frontline combat operations. "I've been thinking about something," Derek said during one of our longer phone conversations. "All those family gatherings where I dominated the conversation with war stories, you must have been sitting there with experiences that made mine look like small-scale operations." "Different scale, different purpose," I replied. "Your stories were about courage under fire, brotherhood, immediate heroism. Mine were about patience, analysis, preventing problems before they became crises. Both were necessary, but both deserved recognition," Derek insisted. "And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." The apology meant more than any medal or commendation ever could. After 15 years of feeling like my service had been dismissed or diminished, I finally had a brother who understood that different types of sacrifice could be equally valuable. Our family dynamics had fundamentally shifted, creating space for both of us to be proud of our service without either of us being diminished by comparison. The next family gathering was our annual Thanksgiving dinner. 6 months after Derek's retirement party, walking into my parents' house, I immediately noticed the changes that reflected our family's new understanding of military service. The hallway display case now featured both of our military careers equally. Derek's Bronze Star and Purple Hearts were prominently displayed alongside my Presidential Unit Citation and the declassified commendation letters. Below our respective honors was a new family photo, both Derek and me in our dress uniforms, taken during a recent veterans ceremony we'd attended together. More importantly, the conversations had changed. When cousins and extended family members asked about our military service, Derek made a point of including my experiences in his responses. Edward and I served during the same period, but fought very different aspects of the war on terror, Derek explained to our cousin Jake, who was now visiting with his teenage son. I was engaged in conventional combat operations, while Edward was working intelligence operations that prevented attacks before they could happen. Jake's son, who was considering military service himself, leaned forward with genuine interest. What kind of intelligence work? Before I could answer, Derek jumped in with enthusiasm. Edward's unit was responsible for tracking terrorist financing networks, preventing weapons, smuggling, and analyzing threats at the international level. The kind of work that shaped policy at the Pentagon and CIA. It was a far cry from the dismissive, paperwork characterizations of previous years. Derek had clearly spent time researching intelligence operations and understanding their strategic importance. Uncle Edward, Jake's son, continued, "How do you choose between different kinds of military service?" I exchanged a look with Derek, and he nodded encouragingly. "You identify your strengths and find where they can best serve your country's needs," I said. "Your Uncle Derek had the courage and leadership skills needed for combat operations, had analytical abilities that were valuable for intelligence work. Both were necessary for mission success. The key," Derek added, "is understanding that military service takes many forms. Combat troops, intelligence analysts, logistics specialists, cybersecurity experts, were all part of the same team, working toward the same objectives." Later, that evening, as the family gathered around the television to watch football, Derek and I found ourselves talking quietly in the kitchen while helping with dishes. "You know what I realized?" Derek said as he dried a plate. "All those years I was the center of attention at family gatherings, telling my war stories and accepting everyone's praise. You never once tried to compete with that, or diminish what I'd accomplished." "Your accomplishments spoke for themselves," I replied, and honestly, I preferred being in the background. It felt safer somehow. "But you deserved better from us," Derek said firmly. "You deserved a family that understood the full scope of your service, even if you couldn't discuss the details." I smiled, feeling the warmth of genuine acceptance and respect. "I have that family now." Derek grinned and clapped me on the shoulder, not the patronizing gesture of years past, but the acknowledgement of one warrior to another. "Yeah," he said, "you do." The balance we'd found felt natural and sustainable. Derek remained the more outgoing brother, the natural storyteller, the one who commanded attention in social situations. But now my quieter contributions were recognized and valued equally. Our different personalities and different types of service had finally been integrated into a family narrative that honored both. 2 years have passed since that Pentagon envelope arrived, fundamentally changing how my family understood my military service and my place within our shared history. As I write this, I'm sitting in my home office in Denver, looking at my own military display case, a shadow box that Derek helped me design, containing my declassified medals, commendations, and a photo of my intelligence unit in Germany. The display sits on the shelf next to my computer, a daily reminder of work that once had to remain invisible but now can be properly acknowledged. More importantly, it represents the end of a 15-year period where I felt like I was living a double life, pretending to be someone I wasn't to protect classified information that I couldn't share. The psychological relief of finally being able to be honest about my service cannot be overstated. For years, I'd carried the weight of invisible victories, prevented catastrophes that would never make headlines, and sacrificed recognition for the greater good of national security. The declassification of those documents didn't just vindicate my service. It allowed me to finally integrate my military identity with my family relationships. Derek and I have developed a friendship that would have been impossible under our old dynamic. We talk regularly about military affairs, veterans issues, and the different challenges facing combat veterans versus those who served in classified capacities. He's become one of my strongest advocates, often explaining to other veterans the critical importance of intelligence work in modern military operations. My advice to others carrying similar burdens is simple. Your worth isn't determined by other people's understanding of your contributions. The work you do, the service you provide, the sacrifices you make, these have value independent of recognition or acknowledgement. External validation is gratifying when it comes, but it shouldn't be necessary for you to know your own value. Sometimes the most important battles are indeed the ones no one can see. Sometimes the greatest victories are the catastrophes that never happen. Sometimes the most crucial service is performed in shadows, measured by silence, and rewarded with the knowledge that people are safe because of work they'll never know occurred. The classified nature of my service meant that for 15 years, my family saw only the surface of who I was and what I'd accomplished. But the truth, as Derek learned that night, has a way of revealing itself eventually. And when it does, the recognition feels even sweeter for having been so long delayed. Some stories are worth waiting to tell. Some truths are worth protecting until they can finally be shared. This was one of them.